Hello, and welcome to World of Warbirds. I'm Brian Pierce. Hello Warbirders, and welcome to this fourth video in this series on Amerika bombers, which were the aircraft that Nazi Germany intended to use to hit targets in North America. It's really quite surprising that in the latter half of the Amerika Bomber project that one of the two designs that were still being considered would be the He277. The reason being that the airplane that the 277 was to be developed from was a bloody disaster, or shall I say fiery disaster. So, before we look at the plans for the version intended to bomb America, we need to look quickly at the origins, the He-177 Greif. The Greif came about due to a Luftwaffe specification seeking an aircraft to carry at least 2,200 pounds of bombs with a range of 3,100 miles and a maximum speed of not less than 311 miles per hour at altitude. Heinkel began building the Greif with many revolutionary features that would have made this, the Luftwaffe's really only long-range strategic bomber, very, very advanced. Firstly, not only would this big bomber be able to level bomb, it would also be able to dive or glide bomb from angles of 60 degrees in order to have a very precise aim at a time when level bomb sights were not the best. The new bomber would feature 3 remote-controlled gun turrets, much like the later American B-29 would have. So rather than having a big hole in the fuselage where a gunner would swing guns around manually and cause a lot of drag, the gun and control positions would all be nicely glazed over and clean. Also, there was the bonus that the gunners would be in a safer and more comfortable position. Another way that the aircraft was to be super clean and free of drag was that the liquid-cooled engines would not have big radiators hanging out there in the wind. Instead, it would be installed with a newfangled fancy setup known as a surface evaporative cooling system. The coolant would be pressurized, as in a pressure cooker or instant pot, to about 110 Celsius or 230 Fahrenheit, picking up more heat. The superheated liquid would leave the engine, flash to steam, and then be routed along a network of pipes along the surface skin of the wings. Basically, the whole wing becomes a radiator without adding any drag. Speaking of engines, the power setup for the Greif was revolutionary too. Instead of having 4 medium-power engines on the wings, like the Allied 4-engine bombers, the Greif would have 2 super engines of 2,000 horsepower or more, turning 2 large-diameter props. This meant that the Greif would have the same power, but with less drag. Everything was looking great for the Greif. Well, not really. On the 9th of November 1939, the first prototype took to the air. Briefly, the test pilot landed after only 12 minutes due to overheating engines. And unfortunately for Heinkel, the Luftwaffe, and any aircrew who had to fly the Greif, this was a sign of things to come. You see, the super engines were actually 2 medium-power engines joined together. The DB601 was a very successful and reliable engine. It was used to power such aircraft as the Messerschmitt Bf-109 and Bf-110, and even Alfa Romeo built a version to power the C-202 Folgore. So, to make a super engine, 2 DB601s were coupled together and called the DB606. What could go wrong with that? Firstly, the fancy-schmancy evaporative cooling system wasn't able to keep up, so they reverted to classic radiators, which caused more drag, and they were still unable to keep up with engine cooling. Another problem was that the coupled engines were cowled very tightly, and it was very difficult for maintenance crews to keep the engine compartments clean, especially between the 2 joined engines. Oil and hydraulic fluids would pool in this area, which was also extremely hot. The pooled, flammable liquids would eventually be ignited by the hot exhaust's radiant heat. There was also no firewall, and so fires in the engine nacelle would quickly spread to the main gear and ignite any leaking hydraulic fluid found there. As the engines were well behind the pilots, fire would often not be noticed until it was too late and the wing spar would be burning through, causing wing failure. More Greifs were lost during the war to engine fires than Allied fire. It was so bad that the Luftwaffe crews called the aircraft the Luftwaffenfeuerzeug, or Air Force Lighter. On top of this, the remote-controlled turret components weren't ready in time, so the Greif got a more conventional turret layout. Also, to get an aircraft this large to dive bomb turned out to be pretty impractical, so that idea was scrapped too. In September 1942, work finally began on making a true four-engine version of the Greif known as the 177B, which would morph into Heinkel's proposal for the Amerika Bomber project, which would be called the 277. It was powered with four individual Daimler-Benz DB603 engines. They were liquid-cooled, 12-cylinder, inverted V12s that were used to power such successful machines as Heinkel's own He277 Uhu night fighter, the Me-410, and the ultimate FW-190 Butcherbirds, which were actually known as TA-152s. These engines were mounted on new, longer-span wings, fitted with annular radiators right behind the propellers, so engine cooling was no longer to be a problem. The 177Bs also had twin tail fins in order to improve in-flight handling. When the 177B prototypes took to the air, test pilots wrote that they could not believe a four-engine heavy bomber could possess such excellent handling capabilities. Later on, it was decided to give the 277 the powerful and reliable BMW 801, which was an air-cooled 14-cylinder radial engine that provided the power for such successful Luftwaffe aircraft as the FW-190 and Ju-88. Versions of it could crank out up to 2,000 horsepower. There was some talk of including a tricycle undercarriage on the 277, but I've never seen a representation of it. It's always shown with the same split front gear and tail wheel, although I have seen different bomb bay sizes listed depending on whether there was going to be a nose wheel or not. The cockpit would still be stepless, but differed from the 177 by having more of a greenhouse on top, like the British Lancaster. And the entire nose was reputed to be influenced by Heinkel's own He277 Uhu. Back at the other end of the fuselage, the 277 was to have twin tail fins, also like the Uhu, which would add much needed stability and more space for a powered, traversable, defensive tail turret with four guns. Speaking of turrets, the 277 would sport four more. In the chin would be a remotely operated twin 20mm cannon. On the dorsal surface would be a remotely controlled turret in the forward dorsal position and a manned one in the rear dorsal position. Both would have two 20mm cannon. On the 277's belly, behind the bomb bay, was a remotely operated rearward-facing ventral turret with two more cannon. As for bomb load, the 277 would have a spacious bomb bay able to carry up to 7,000 pounds of bombs for transatlantic missions, and a maximum of 12,000 pounds internally for shorter ranges. There were also to be four underwing hardpoints, two on each wing, for external bomb or missile loads or drop tanks. On July 23, 1943, some new instructions came down from the Reich Air Ministry's technical department for Heinkel to design wings for the 277 able to accept 6 engines, which was now being seen as the best configuration for the Amerika Bomber. By this time, only the 277 and the TA-400 were in competition for the job. With 6 engines, it makes one wonder if a final, matured Amerika Bomber product would have ended up being like the Americans' B-36 Peacemaker, but we'll never know. In April 1944, there were 4 He-177B prototypes already completed. 3 were flying, and 1 was nearing flying status when the RLM pulled the plug on the project. With the crisis over the Reich, the RLM was switching to a fully defensive role. No completed examples of the 277 were ever completed by Heinkel before the emergency fighter program began 2 months later. Next time on World of Warbirds, we will look at a truly revolutionary design for the Amerika Bomber program, the Horton 18 Flying Wing, which looks like it came right out of a time machine from the future. Please help support this channel. Show your love by hitting me with a super thanks, a like, or join me on Patreon. Check out the dozens of other videos and the hours of audio content in the extensive back catalog of podcast episodes. Until next time.